Welcome to the third unit in the Criminal Justice Research Methods course. This unit is going to focus on measurement, and measurement is where the rubber hits the road. It certainly is important to have a good theory. It's important to have a good hypotheses with correctly identified dependent and independent variables. But if those variables are not measured correctly, if we do not have an accurate indicator of our concepts, in other words, if we're not really measuring and examining what we think we're measuring and examining and what we're testing in our hypotheses, we're going to fail, and our study is not going to be a good scientifically valid study, and it's not going to have any use. So when we talk about measurement, really what we're talking about in this unit is coming up with ways to measure our variables, to find indicators, to find things that we can count, things that we can score. And it is these things that we count, these things that we score, these values that we assign to our variables that we then compare, whether we use statistical analysis or some other type of research design that just looks for differences in our variables. How well we have done at measurement and how accurately we are actually capturing the concepts, the things that we are trying to gauge, goes a long way to determining the value and the ultimate worth of our study. A lot of the terms in this unit are going to be foreign to you, going to be a little bit strange, but I want to assure you this isn't rocket science. It is science, however, and with effort, with application on your part, with thinking these things through, going and finding examples of published studies in the literature, seeing how other authors have dealt with these issues of measurement, you will be able to develop a good grasp of measurement and the different ideas contained within this notion of measurement, representing variables with numbers, that you will be able to do this with your own study, with your own research design. So again, we're going to talk about some terms and ideas that may not make much sense immediately to you, but I encourage you to read the book a couple times, maybe listen to these slides a couple times, and before you know it, you'll be able to do this. There's a lot of different words on this slide, and I'm going to do my best to put some flesh around these words and help you understand what they mean, because as you move forward through this course, and particularly as you are putting together your research design and you are wrestling with coming up with your variables and ways that you will measure your variables, you'll be coming back to these ideas and working with them and through them in order to come up with your variable, again, the thing that you're going to count. Measurement can be very difficult. It's often very imprecise. What we are trying to do here is take an abstract idea and assign numbers to it, or some other scoring system to it. Whether that abstract idea is, again, fear of crime, police corruption, recidivism, racial prejudice, poverty, low education levels. Those are all concepts. Those are all ideas that represent something, and the trick of measurement, or the art of measurement, is going to be coming up with values, with scores that we can assign to these concepts that will tell us not only whether or not that concept is present, not only whether somebody is racially prejudiced, but also to the degree that person might be racially prejudiced. One way to gauge how accurate our study is to evaluate how well we have measured our variables. And measurement is like a process that involves going from our vague idea or from our very clear idea, it's a process that goes from our concept to being able to recognize that concept and measure it in the real world. Okay, let's just look at education, level of education as an example. How would we measure level of education? We have a research study where a person's level of education is hypothesized to have a key influence on our dependent variable. Well, how are we going to measure that? How might we measure level of education? Well, there's a variety of ways that that we can do it, that you could think of. We could use a test, whether that's an IQ test or some other type of test. We could look at the highest grade completed for that individual. Whether or not having a bachelor's degree or any kind of a degree might be another measure. All of these are used and have been used in various studies, but they all have drawbacks. Okay, having a degree, yes, that does signify something, but then on the other hand, where did you get that degree? How hard did you work to get that degree? What was your grade point average? So again, just having the degree, while it does signify something, it's not really a very precise measure. It's not a precise indicator. So yeah, measurement is difficult, but again, there are principles, there are methods that we can use that will help us sharpen and improve our measures, and that is going to be the focus of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this unit. Concepts, I've used that term a couple of times already. One way to define a concept is it's a word or it's a symbol in our language that we use that represents some mental image that we have. So concepts are words or images that we use to represent images that we carry around in our minds. And these images can be of crime, justice, corruption, fear. Again, things that maybe we think we know what they mean and we could describe them in words, but then to try to go and actually measure that. Okay, how would you measure corruption? Who's your unit of analysis? Are you looking at police officers, average citizens, judges, politicians? What's our unit of analysis? So the concept is this word, this image that we have, and it is the concept that we then try to reduce to some type of indicator. Conceptualization is a process by which we specify exactly what we mean when we use particular terms. I talked about corruption. What do we mean by that? Who are we looking at? And then we have to go further and describe what it is we mean. What do we mean when we're talking about violent crime or poverty or racial bias? The process of conceptualization forces the researcher to be very clear and specific about what that term means for the purposes of the study. And in your research design, again, you're going to be expected to clearly spell out what you mean by the concepts that you have chosen. Indicators and dimensions, I've used that word indicator a couple of times already. When we have properly conceptualized our variables, when we have worked out exactly what we mean by our terms, we have a set of indicators. Okay, so the process of conceptualization helps us to create our indicators. When we have clearly identified what it is we mean by poverty, that points us to an indicator that helps us determine what it is that we're going to look for that is going to represent the concept of poverty. It allows us to determine a good indicator. Not only will tell us whether the concept is present, but also to what degree. Okay, so again, using poverty as an example, yeah, we could say poverty is this neighborhood has a certain amount of poverty. Well, how much poverty? Okay, what degree do we have? And so one identifying trait of a good indicator is it can also give us a sense of the dimension of that concept. Okay, so is it present? Is our concept present? And also to what degree? Again, if we're using the concept of racial bias, we will need to define that term in a specific way, say as it relates to people in a community. Then we would have to operationalize our variable, racial bias, and we could do this by developing a set of survey questions that will enable us to tell whether an individual exhibits racial bias and to what degree. So that's this notion of indicators and dimensions. Is the variable present? Is the concept present? And also to what degree? Clearly this isn't an easy task, though for some variables it is easier than others, and we'll talk more about that as we proceed here. The conceptual definition is the working definition specifically assigned to a term. It helps us focus our data collection strategies, and it also helps others who might be reading our study. It helps them understand exactly what it is we mean when we are using our terms. Okay, so a good conceptual definition gives us the working definition that we're using, that we've assigned to our term, which has the benefit of helping us focus our data collection strategies, getting us headed in the right direction, but then it also helps others understand our study. And remember when we talked about the nature of science, I mentioned this idea of replicability. A key part of science is the ability for somebody else to come along and replicate your study, to redo your study. And what allows people to redo a study or replicate a study is clearly defined conceptual definitions. Then that brings us to the operational definition, and the operational definition is where you spell out the exact process that you will use through which the concept will be measured. What are the data collection strategies? Are you going to use surveys? Are you going to look at existing records? Are you going to do some field work? How are you going to measure racial bias? Are you going to use a survey? Are you going to look at sentencing patterns of judges perhaps? How are you going to measure poverty? Are you going to use census tract data? Some type of other federal guideline? What is it? How are you going to do it? The operational definition spells that out exactly, how you're going to measure your concept. So just to quickly summarize the different steps that are taken in measurement, conceptualization lies at the top. And again, this is where you think about your variables, you think about the concepts you're using in your study, and you specify exactly what you mean by those terms. Okay, so you take the abstract concepts or the abstract ideas, again, crime, justice, poverty, racism, and you begin to narrow those down, to give them greater boundaries, greater definition. You conceptualize those terms. That leads to your conceptual definition, which is again the working definition that you've designed, that you have come up with for that term, which then leads you to the operational definition, the exact process you're going to use to gather your data, to measure your data, the steps you're going to take to determine whether or not your concept is present and to what degree. And then finally that leads to the actual measurement process itself, going out into the real world and gathering your data. So again, it's this little diagram here also shows the process of going from the abstract concept, defining it a little bit more, giving it further definition in terms of how you're actually going to go out and collect the data, and then finally going out and collecting the data. I want to say a little bit more about operationalization, about defining our abstract concepts in precise and concrete terms. For instance, if we're trying to measure the length of a sentence, that's pretty straightforward. We could use months or we could use years. We would be able to gain access to sentencing records, so the gathering of the data would be fairly easy, fairly straightforward. If we were measuring fear of crime, though, and that would be more difficult. We could rely on survey research, but then we would have to come up with the proper questions that would allow you to gauge both whether a person was fearful of crime and to what degree. Again, that's that notion of, is the concept present and to what degree. So measuring fear of crime, and this is a common measure. If you go out and you look at the literature, you'll see it used in many different studies, and most often it is measured by survey research. And then the trick becomes coming up with the proper questions that would allow you to gauge both whether the person was fearful of crime and to what degree. And we'll talk in a subsequent unit about how you create good surveys, but that can be tough. That can be difficult, coming up with the right questions that can give you reliable, valid data, and also give you the ability to measure some of these tricky concepts that we often use. We want to think of measurement as scoring. And what we're doing is we're using numbers or we're using labels to represent our conceptual properties. If we're looking at income level, we could use the actual dollars. That's a very straightforward, frequently used way to measure income level. Or we could be a little more general, not as precise, and we could distinguish between lower class, middle class, or upper class. So in the first instance, when we were measuring actual dollars, we were using numbers. The latter one, when we're talking about lower, middle, or upper class, we're now using labels. So either one is okay. The way you decide which one you want to use is going to depend on the nature of your study and how you're going to analyze your data. Because we'll see here in a second, the way that the level at which you collect your data will have an influence on how you can analyze that data. So we use numbers and labels to represent our properties, and then we actually make our observations and we assign scores. You collect the data, whether that is through field research, whether again that's through surveys, or collecting data from existing records, and then we assign scores. Now usually when we assign scores, that's done most often with survey research or some type of field work. If we're using statistics that have already been gathered, already been published somewhere, we don't have to assign scores. We're using just the number itself. But when we're doing survey research or other type of field research, then frequently we're also going to have to come up with scores. We're going to have to somehow code our data, our findings. One other thing I want to say about variables at this point, and that we need to keep in mind when we are operationalizing our variables, is they need to be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. In other words, everything needs to be covered. All possible answers somehow have to be represented, even if that means you have a category on your survey that just says other or none of the above. But particularly with surveys, what you need to make sure of is that the person who's answering the survey doesn't get confused, isn't sure what to put down, and so you want to make sure that all the categories are represented there. That's what it means to have an exhaustive variable. Mutually exclusive means that the categories have to be exclusive. They have to be distinct and separate. Again, the person filling out a survey needs to know that there's only one right answer, or one value to indicate. So clean lines, distinct values. When you have variables that are both exhaustive and mutually exclusive, you have a good variable. Variables come in different levels or different types, and they have different uses. A key difference between these levels is the type of analysis that you can perform with them. And so as you are constructing your research design and you are thinking of ways to measure your concepts, you're going to be identifying the different levels of measurement that your variables are going to need. And again, how the different levels of measurement that you're going to be employing in your study will again influence how you go about collecting your data. There are 3 or 4 different levels of measurement. Most books will indicate 4 levels, although the 3rd and the 4th one are similar in practically all respects. And so in this slide I'm lumping those 2 together. They are presented on this slide in reverse order of sophistication, of the amount of information that is contained in the variable. And in other words, they're arranged in order from lower to higher levels of measurement. And we'll start with the nominal level. This is considered to be the lowest level of measurement. Nominal variables are just categories. They're just classifications. And gender, race, and religion are nominal variables that are used quite frequently. but I'm sure you could think of many others as well. Again, these are just they're simple descriptive variables that indicate a particular classification or category that a person or a place, or what depending on what your unit of analysis is, where that case might fall. The second level of measurement is ordinal, and as you can kind of tell by the word, there's an order implied in this variable. There's a hierarchy of values, and where this is used frequently is if you've taken surveys and you're asked to rate something or respond to something based on your level of agreement, whether you strongly agree with a statement or strongly disagree with that statement, and then there are, of course, different levels between those two extremes. That's an example of an ordinal variable. We could create a crime variable that tried to rank various crimes based on their seriousness. That would be considered an ordinal variable. Ordinal variables carry a little more information as opposed to nominal variables, because you get a sense of, again, how one particular value ranks in terms of another value. You don't have that with a nominal variable. You cannot say that one category is better than another in a nominal variable. They're all treated as equal. Ordinal variables adds a little more information because you do have that ability to rank the values. The last one, the third and the fourth level, is interval/ratio. Interval and ratio variables are true numbers. They are true mathematical numbers that have mathematical properties. And the difference between 10 and 20 is the same as the difference between 100 and 110. And so you have that added bit of information that not only do you have order now, but you also have magnitude. So that's what, when I said that the higher levels of measurement contain more information, that's what I mean. Not only can you compare based on the ordering of the values, but you can also assess differences of magnitude. You cannot assess differences of magnitude with ordinal variables, however. Again, what's the difference between strongly disagree and disagree? Okay, even though it's a difference of 1 on our scale, there's no fixed mathematical difference there, and it can mean different things to different people. Whereas again, with an interval or a ratio variable, the difference between 10 and 5 is the same as the difference between 12 and 7. It's 5 units. So which one should you use? I mean, generally speaking, you always want to try to use interval level variables whenever you can, because it contains more information. It's considered to be a higher form of measurement, and you also can do more with these variables in terms of statistical techniques. You can calculate averages, for instance, or percentages, things that you cannot do with nominal or ordinal variables. But beyond that, it's really going to depend on your study. The way you want to analyze a variable should be determined by, or will determine, the measurement that you need. And so how you're going to analyze your data is going to impact how you're going to collect your data and what level you're going to collect. Now again, this isn't to say that there's no place for nominal variables or there's no place for ordinal variables. Surveys are generally all nominal and ordinal variables, and they have many, many uses. And within a given study, you will probably have all three of these. So again, you're not limited to one or the other. It's going to be driven purely by the nature of your research question and how you operationalize your variables. It is always necessary to evaluate our own measures and strive to employ measures that do the best job of representing the concepts in our study. There are two ways to evaluate our measures, and these two ways are reliability and validity, terms that are going to keep cropping up now as we move forward. Previously, we have discussed validity as it relates to our study as a whole and to inferring causality. Here we're going to talk about validity in terms of our measures. And the two types of validity, these two different types of validity are related to each other, since the accuracy of our measures will influence the interpretability of our study. Let's start with reliability, however. The definition of reliability is whether a particular measurement technique, whether that's field observations or face-to-face interviews or surveys, if that particular measurement technique, if applied repeatedly, would give us the same result. In other words, is our instrument reliable? Will it give us the same result if we do it more than one time? We never want the survey to be constructed in such a way that people might interpret it different ways at different times. So, for instance, if we're using a survey to measure police job satisfaction, a reliable survey would be one that would give consistent results if we gave the survey numerous times to the same individuals. In other words, we would not want to see fluctuations in the reported level of satisfaction caused by the measuring instrument itself, caused by the survey itself. So a reliable survey is one that is constructed in such a way that if we were to give the survey more than once to the same individuals, we would get the same results. Okay, the respondents would interpret their questions consistently and would give the same results. There's a couple of ways that we can enhance the reliability of our measures. The first is called the test-retest method, and just as it sounds, this is where you would apply the survey once and then do it again to verify that you get similar findings. And what is usually done here is you find a sample group. This isn't going to be the group that you're going to actually be studying, isn't going to be the group that you're going to be collecting data on, but it's just somebody who's going to take your survey at two different points in time, and you want to make sure that the results are the same. The results are consistent each time. The test, retest. Another way to think about this is sometimes it's using a pilot survey. You've created this instrument, you want to test it out, you want to see how well it works. Test, retest is a way to pilot study the survey to see if it's reliable. Another way to enhance reliability is through inter-rater reliability, and this is really crucial, really important when you are using more than one person to code your data, to collect and code your data. You want to make sure that the different individuals are interpreting the same items the same way. And you can do this by providing training to the people who are going to be collecting and coding the data. Training that would ensure that the different researchers are applying the same criteria when assigning values. So again, one way of evaluating our measures, of judging our measures, is through this notion of reliability, and we've just talked about two different ways that we can enhance the reliability of our instruments. The second one, validity, again, is this notion of, are we measuring what we say we are measuring? Okay, are we really measuring corruption? Are we really measuring poverty? Are we really measuring recidivism? Or is our instrument somehow giving us something else? There are a couple different ways, or we're going to talk about 4 different ways to assess the accuracy of our measuring instruments, to assess the validity of our measuring instruments. The first is called face validity, and this is very straightforward. Does it make sense? Okay, does it make sense to use years of education to represent level of education, or highest degree completed to represent level of education? Okay, does our variable correspond with the way that we view things, with our common understandings, with our common agreements? So face validity is maybe the lowest form of validity, because it just kind of on the surface, does using this indicator make sense when we're trying to measure this concept? The second one, criterion-related validity, is a little more complicated, a little more complex. And here's where it compares the measure that we're using to some outside criterion. And then what we try to find a measure that can be shown, or the measure will be shown to have validity if it can be used to predict or explain values on some other variable. Okay, for instance, if you developed a measure that explained recidivism, okay, you have a variable that you're using to measure recidivism, to explain recidivism, and then you check that variable against arrest records and found that those with high scores on your recidivism variable also happen to reoffend most frequently, then your variable would be valid. Okay? So again, you've developed this variable that in essence you are testing on some outside criterion. Some outside criterion that should be related to your variable. Your new measure of recidivism does show that those that have higher values on your new variable also tended to reoffend the most. Therefore, they had higher values of recidivism, or they were repeat recidivists. Then your variable would be said to be valid. The third way to evaluate validity is construct validity. Construct validity is where you assess the relationship between your variables in a logical way. Is there a logical relationship between your variables? Do they relate to each other in a logical fashion? Okay, so now you're not relying on external sources to test the validity here. You are again just using logic, the rules and the principles of logic, to make sure that they fit, that there is a relationship, that the variables do relate to each other in a logical way. The fourth one, content validity, gets at the notion of how well your measure includes the whole range of meanings within the concept. Okay, have you included all of the different aspects of the concept that you're trying to measure? So again, if you were trying to measure police corruption, have you come up with a variable that includes all of those different aspects of what might go into police corruption? And now remember, we always want to go back to our conceptual definition and our operational definition by what exactly do we mean by police corruption. If all we mean by police corruption for purposes of our study is bribery, susceptibility to taking bribes, well then you don't have to worry about some of those other forms of police corruption. So, again, how you conceptually define your variable will also impact this process of enhancing and ensuring reliability and validity. The last thing I want to talk about in this unit on measurement is using composite measures. Often the concepts that we are trying to measure are difficult to try and represent with one variable. I mentioned social disorganization previously. What would be the best way to measure social disorganization? How could we tell whether an area had low levels or high levels of social disorganization? We could look at concepts such as poverty, unemployment, education level, number of crimes committed, perhaps the number of bars within the area or the number of liquor stores within the area, the number and type of medical facilities, the perceptions of the citizens within that area. All of those different things, could be argued are somewhat related to social disorganization, and maybe all of them could in some way be used to represent social disorganization. But individually, they would not adequately capture that concept. So therefore what we would want to create is what's called an index. An index is a combination of individual measures that gives us a more valid and reliable measure. Okay? So the idea of creating an index is, particularly for concepts that are really complex, that are hard to measure with one indicator, is you try to identify all of the different component parts of that concept. All of the different component parts of social disorganization that we mentioned. We would collect data on each one of those component parts. We would somehow have to standardize that data, and that can be easier said than done, and often it is this need to standardize the data that will limit some of the variables that we can include in our index. For instance, with the variables I mentioned before, poverty we could measure as a rate, unemployment we could measure as a rate, education level we could measure as the rate of citizens who had achieved a certain education level. Number of crimes committed could be measured as a rate. Some of the other ones maybe would be a little bit more difficult to do it that way, but we would identify those variables, those things that represent this broader concept that we are trying to measure, that we would be able to measure it in the same, at the same level, and then we can create our index out of those. And this is somewhat of a mathematical operation where we would sum all of these different numbers. And in effect, what an index is it creates one variable, gives us one score that captures all of these other different parts to it. And it is because it captures all of those other different parts that's what makes it a more valid measure. It also has the property of having more variation, which is important when it comes time to do some statistical analysis on our data. Because it has more variation, it helps in the explanation of our problem. It helps in the explanation of our concepts, or the prediction of whatever a dependent variable is. So an index, by definition, has more variation than just a single variable will, which helps us to refine our study. And then it also helps us create more parsimonious models. And what parsimony means is it's this principle in science that we try to explain with as few variables as possible. And you try to explain your concepts in as few variables as possible. That's considered to be a parsimonious model. You don't have to always try to include everything in the explanations. We talked about this a little bit before when we described the difference between idiographic and nomothetic explanations. Parsimonious models just have fewer variables, and scientists tend to like parsimonious models better because they have greater generalizability. Right? They can be applied to more situations. So that's a little discussion, a brief walk through measurement. I've tried to define some of the terms a little bit better for you. Again, I think this is a chapter that you're going to want to look at more than once. You're going to want to really try to understand these terms, and perhaps most important of all, look to see how other people have wrestled with this problem. Many of the studies in the literature that you will look at, that you can find, will talk about how they operationalized a variable, how they conceptualized their variable. What do they mean exactly by the terms that they're using? How do they go about and collect the data? How do they assess the validity and reliability of their measures? The more you look at how other people explain these things and how they have been actually applied in research studies, the greater you will understand this material, the better your research design is going to be.